Hey guys, welcome to book review 149. Today I am going to be reviewing Escape from North Korea, the untold story of Asia's Underground Railroad. So, there you go. So, as the title would imply, this book is about North Koreans who escape North Korea and eventually wind up in South Korea or other safe havens. Some quick kind of logistics about uh, just the escape routes. The DMZ between North Korea and South Korea is so militarized that essentially no one can escape. There's been, I think, a few reported incidents of very strategically placed soldiers that were able to kind of get away um, because of their place along the border, or you know, people in the North Korean Air Force that were able to defect. But everyday North Koreans can essentially not get across the North Korean South Korean border. So, what is the other border, more or less, that North Korea has? It's with China. And that's where the majority of North Koreans escape. I think maybe there's been about 250,000 North Koreans that have been documented to have escaped North Korea. Most of those being since the early to mid 90s. Um, Before then, uh, North Korea was a very repressive regime, but maybe it wasn't really scraping the bottom of the barrel. The thing that changed in the 90s was that, particularly the early 90s, was that its benefactor, the Soviet Union, fell apart. And so a lot of the trade and really aid that came from the Soviet Union to help prop up the North Korean state disappeared. With this, it resulted in a massive food shortage. There were starvations and really deprivations across North Korea to a huge extent. Um, so, North Koreans, by rumor, by um, their own guile, essentially because North Korea is one of the most repressive states on earth. They cross the border. Something else about the starvation, real quick. Uh, the North Korean regime, needless to say, this is an understatement of the century, but is evil, is a terrible regime. In addition to having food shortages, uh, the North Korean government actually manipulates and still manipulated, and I still think manipulates um, food supplies in order to get people to politically align with their goals. They'll cut short areas or even neighborhoods or people food supplies based on their loyalty or their um, opposition to party rule. Obviously, if you're opposed to the North Korean party, then your food shortage will be shut off. If there's anything beyond that, you're likely to go either to a local prison or a political prison. Um, it's terrible. There's ample reason for North Koreans to flee the country. So most of the time, when they are fleeing the country, they get to and across the border on their own, though not always the case. Um, so often, what happens is they find some pretext to get up to a border region with China in the north, specifically the Tumen River, which I believe is the river that is in the north, kind of east of the country, the northwest of the country, having better security along its border with China, and therefore there are less defections there. Um, there are cases more recently where brokers will go into China or will go into North Korea and help people out, but particularly in the 90s and even into the early 2000s, most of the escapes were on their own. Um, but what would happen is these North Koreans would escape into China, which is still nominally communist, but has opened up its economic reign quite a bit. Um, But kind of one of the key points is that China, against treaties that it signed, including treaties that prevent countries from sending refugees back to home countries where they will be tortured, murdered, go to political prison, just anything along that. China has signed those treaties, but even though they've signed those treaties, they still internally send North Koreans back to North Korea, where they often go into a gulag type situation. So what has developed, and as the title of the book says, is the underground, is the Asia's Underground Railroad. Now this is often set up by Christian organizations, nonprofits, that and some for-profits that essentially try to get people or North Korean refugees that are hiding in China, often kind of in very, if not, it's sort of desperate circumstances. In circumstances where if they're found out, every day they're at the risk of being found out and being deported to North Korea. So these organizations that work within China, not openly, because if they're found out about it, they can either go to jail or themselves be expelled from the country, help get North Korean refugees to third-party countries or to consulates or embassies within China, where they're granted political asylum until they're granted exit visas from China to another country, but only in the case of going to embassies. If they're caught within the mainland part of China, then they're repatriated into North Korea. So yeah, the book really talks about a number of circumstances that are involved in this. It talks about the numerous groups, including, let's see if I can, they have a list of some of them in the back. I specifically remember there's like a link is one of them. Let's see. Committee for Human Rights in North Korea, Crossing Borders, Defense Forum Foundation, Good Friends, Research Institute for North Korean Society, Helping Hands, Korea, the Korean Courage Coalition, the Liberty in North Korea, that's blank, North Korean Refugee Services Mission, and the 318 Partners Mission Foundation, all in various ways work for North Koreans. They're not all necessarily directly involved in the underground. A lot of those organizations help kind of settle North Koreans after they've gotten out of China, but they're all tied to sort of the very long process of getting North Koreans to third countries where they can start new lives for themselves and be in safe environments. Let's see. So yeah, I kind of talked about crossing the river. Something interesting. I think the number of women that cross to men is like 3 to 1 out of North Korea. Part of this is because as much as North Korea says that they're equal under socialism, a lot of sort of the tabs that are kept on by the government are men and then women. Like it'll be the male head of the household, and then the women that are involved. So women just have a better opportunity to escape, and so when they get into China, often what happens is if they don't get to a third-party country or linked up with a nonprofit organization, which can be very dicey, they kind of come across the border and they're kind of looking for a needle in the haystack with these organizations because they can't exactly be out front. And so if they're not caught and they're not by the Chinese government and they're not found by one of these nonprofit organizations, often what happens is they eventually get involved with a broker that sets them up for a marriage with a Chinese man. China having a much higher male to female population than the reverse. an unfortunate aspect about this, though, is that uh, obviously these marriages are not legally recognized by the government. So it's really up to the whims of the Chinese husband how to treat his wife. Some of them do well, but a lot of them take advantage of the fact that, uh, to use a odd American expression, they essentially uh, have have these women by the balls, if you will, that essentially the women have no recourse for, say, domestic abuse or just anything along those lines. They can't divorce these men because often then they'll be left out in the cold with a very likely chance that they get sent back to North Korea. Um, and then the children of these Chinese North Korean relationships are not recognized either. Now, by definition, the son, the son or the daughter of a Chinese national is registered as a Chinese national. But to do that, they have to go to the local board and essentially say who the father is, who the mother is. So these children often don't get registered and get their national identity card, if you will, that provides them all sorts of things from educational opportunities to health opportunities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, because of that. So the children, in a very sad circumstance, often wind up in these orphanages that are run by these nonprofits. The few that are lucky get to do that. Let's see, Siberia's last gulag. Something interesting about North Korea is that they still send soldiers into work timber plantations, or whatever you want to call it, timber mills, cutting timber in the Siberian taiga, often under sort of chain gang circumstances. This is kind of in mirror to the gulags that existed in the Soviet Union days, but still exist because of a deal that Russia decided to keep after they became a new country from the Soviet Union. The deal that they kept, they still kept that deal with North Korea, so North Korea is still sending soldiers there. Often, missionaries in Siberia will help these people escape out of the country. Now, Russia kind of has a laissez-faire approach to refugees, North Korean refugees within this country. First of all, there's a lot fewer because not very many are going up to North Korea in these chain gangs, even though it's horrific that they are. Most of them are in China. But I'm pretty sure that Russia will not deport them back to North Korea, but what they will do is essentially turn them over to private handlers that are North Korean security forces acting within North Korea, and by force they'll pretty much make them go back into China. Old soldiers. Let's see. The book talks quite a bit about a lot of the fundraising in the United States and in South Korea, and how these organizations kind of drum up support. There was the specific story of Link, where they go across the country in a minivan. 3 college-age students just kind of getting small donations at a time. These organizations are definitely not funded by fat cat donors. They're more church organizations or NGOs with numerous, a handful of small-time donations in order to help them out. And as something mentioned in the book is also that it's really sad because a lot of times these NGOs know about North Koreans that can help, but they just don't have the opportunity to get them out because they just don't have the funds to. They can only take on so many people to get them out of China. It used to be that the two most popular ways previously to get North Korean national refugees out of China was either the consulate or the embassies. But what happened is China started putting their own security forces around the consulates and the embassies so that North Koreans could no longer charge the gates and get into these embassies. The other one that was popular was Mongolia, that maintains good relationships, surprisingly, with both the Koreas. But if there were North Korean nationals that made it to Mongolia, they were sent to South Korea to essentially live their new lives. The problem being that most of Mongolia is so remote that you would think it would be a good place to get people across the border. But because there's so few people out there, it's actually somewhat easier to monitor who, even though the border is porous in terms of the actual border itself, there's so much dead space between civilization in Mongolia and civilization in China that it actually became somewhat easier for the Chinese government to maintain. So the most popular way for people to go, or for refugees from, hiding refugees in North Korea to go, is to get with one of these NGO organizations and go to Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar, all having various policies on how they treat refugees, but all ultimately sending these North Korean refugees to South Korea. Probably the best one is Thailand. Thailand and South Korea maintain very close ties, and although they are detained, North Korean refugees are detained in Thailand, their process is somewhat expedited. In both, or really in all three, in Myanmar, Cambodia, and Vietnam, all which have communist past, and I think to a degree Laos too, it's much more kind of grim detainee situations where there's just a lot more processing in order to get these people out of the country. Vietnam specifically had the case where they'll deport people now, but it'll be on the South Korean dime, specifically because I think in the early 2000s, Vietnam had an instance where they had like 300 refugees that were all in detention, and they were secretly going to fly a whole plane, like a whole Boeing plane or whatever, initiated from their country, not from the South Koreans, secretly to South Korea, and let these people be refugees there. But that story or that incident leaked and created a big diplomatic brouhaha between North Korea and Vietnam, seeing that North Korea just essentially acts belligerently to any instance of resettled North Korean refugees. Okay, so stockholders hunted on the border. Kind of the book ends with things that necessarily don't have to do with refugees, but kind of have to do with just the information state of North Korea, specifically how more people have the knowledge that they can leave, because as technology is advancing, secretly, so things like cell phones, transistor radios, DVDs with hidden anti-propaganda or anti-North Korean material on them are just sneaking by small-time traders into North Korea. Something interesting about the cell phones, to show you how backwards North Korea is, they do have their own cell phone system set up by some Egyptian company. But much like the internet, it is highly maintained that essentially it has no contact with the outside world. The cell phones are programmed so you can only call other people in North Korea. This is the official cell phones. Only call other people in North Korea, and I'm sure they're all tapped by the North Korean government. But these illegal cheap cell phones from China come in, and for people that aren't necessarily ready to cross the border but want contact with, say, like family members that have previously fled, that being a big thing of bringing ex-family members out of the country and trying to convince them, often because the North Korean regime, being the evil country that they are, I'm kind of whining around here, the evil country that they are, will often punish family members for defection, often, almost always, punish family members for defections of brothers, sisters, even cousins. And that's a way to kind of through their Orwellian nightmare to try to prevent people from fleeing, even though it still happens, is that they're gonna punish their family. But back to the cell phones. For people that maybe aren't quite ready to leave yet but want to make an outside call, they'll actually, this is how backwards it is and how every day we think of, you know, cell phones in the West or whatever. They travel to the North Korean Chinese border, don't cross the border, but are within range of cell phone towers within the border area of China, and use those Chinese cell phone towers to call people either in South Korea or all over the world. And it's a huge risk, but also a huge event to make these outside cell phone calls outside the country. Ultimately, the book ends with, as I said, kind of the about how information and the access to information is changing North Korea, how it could eventually be the downfall of the country. I will say that this book takes a very it also goes to a number of like shortwave radio broadcast stations in South Korea and talks to their owners. I think it's called Radio Free North Korea, or Voice of North Korea. There's 4 or 5 organizations that broadcast into the country, and it's the North Korean government actually programs their radios too, so that it can only be on a frequency to propaganda from the north. But unlike the cell phones, the radios can be pretty easily manipulated just by opening up the back and changing a few settings to allow them to listen to these South Korean, anti-North Korean broadcasts. So yeah, the book kind of ends with the information wars. I will say they are very hard line in their view of North Korea. I would say that this is not incorrect. This is correct. North Korea is evil. They are pretty much the worst. I would not necessarily blame them. I do think that there is, if the North Korean regime is going to end as we know it, it is going to take both a stick and a carrot. It just can't be a stick, because I think it could get really ugly with the military if it's only a stick. I will say the sunshine policy that was the South Korean government was often criticized in this book. The South Korean government policy from, I believe, like 1998 to 2008 was very much glossed over how horrible things were in North Korea. The torture, the executions, the fact that there was, food manipulations, just the gulags, just how truly awful it was. And the Sunshine Policy, while I guess good in its intent of trying to bring the two Koreas together, ultimately really ignored the extent of how horrible the North Korean regime is. So, gone on for quite a bit. Escape from North Korea, the untold story of Asia's underground. There's plenty of more in here, and it's a fascinating book. I read it in about 3 days. So, by Melanie Kirkpatrick. All right, check it out, you guys. See ya. Bye.